Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about confronting many of our dilemmas about democracy in the early part of the 21st century. Our third series, as many of you will know, is focusing on the whole issue of citizenship. One of the areas that we haven't talked about yet in our series is the geography, or shall we say the architecture of citizenship. What places or spaces should one want or can be a citizen? And I have on the show today somebody who has spent their career thinking about the geography, the architecture of public spaces. Bianca Wylie is a Canadian-based advocate. She calls herself an advocate of open government. She's the co-founder of Digital Public and has done a lot of work inside and outside government about the building of public space. Bianca, should we talk about the geography or the architecture of public space? What word sums it up?
They're both good. I think geography can be confusing in the digital age because some of the things that are hemmed in by nation states and boundaries have come completely undone, and because the internet knows no state, as its container. So I think that's an interesting feature of the word geography. And in Canada, as we're having a reckoning with reconciliation and long history of state violence and land, geography feels particularly important to look at, in terms of relationships to land and what stems from it. In terms of architecture, it's interesting. Again, architecture very strongly correlated to discussions of the internet and technology.
In our first series, Bianca, I actually had the good fortune to travel to Athens and look at not the architecture or the geography, but the archaeology of citizenship, the remains of the Greek polis. The Greeks, or the Greeks of antiquity, like the idea of practicing citizenship in a certain place, in the polis. In the modern world, in the 21st century world, do you think there should be spaces designed, limited to citizenship?
No, I think there's a lot in there that would be helpful to have intentionally designed spaces for, the activities and practices related to citizenship, and particularly as they relate to scale and relationship, because without being in true, I think, relation with each other, our practice of democracy is really difficult to pull off. And I think what we see in a lot of the abstraction and digital versions of conversation is we're losing the practice. I mean, losing, if some people have even had it, of how to have good relationships in citizenship, particularly when people disagree with each other. I've always been careful with citizenship versus residency. And I think where citizenship gets interesting as a word in this time is we hear a lot about rights. We hear very little about obligations. And I think that's that. Exactly. And so I think when I think about how a defined and intentional public space for democracy might be helpful, it's that the practice, the protocol, the implementation, the process expertise required to self-govern, or at least govern together, we desperately need to build that muscle. And I think what you've suggested would be one way to go about it.
In your ideal world, think in a utopian way, Bianca. Imagine that there are no limitations, no boundaries. What should the geography of citizenship look like, and what should the citizen themselves look like? Should it be a town square, a place publicly owned, a place where people would meet every day, a modern version of the polis, where they would dress up both literally and figuratively to take on the responsibility of self-government?
It's an interesting provocation. I mean, I think and to think in a everything on the table way, this city right now feels like, of all the ways governance is organized, as the space of the most opportunity to do something like this, and potentially in much smaller and hyper-local versions of it, you know, because cities are large, like Toronto, for example, around almost 4 million people. That scale is not tenable, right? And so what does it look like to have a hyper-local version of a space where people come together? And to the question, I think hyper-local is a feature, and having things related to that physicality, as you mentioned, whether it's dress or other elements of protocol, tradition, norm setting, you know, things that become just the way things are done, rather than what I think has happened in modern time is so much of a deference to written policy and things that have become abstracted from things that are familiar to each person in a democracy. So I think a lot of these things, there's an interesting theme here, which is relating back to physicality. How do we get out of the abstract and into each other? You know, how do we move our conversations into spaces where, and I find this spaces where we're together, and I think local, hyper-local small grouping is important, because to be understood by someone else requires, to my mind, frequent checking with each other. Did you understand the last two things I said? Yes, no, there's room here. You know, you can have body language to be open to, like, oh, actually that's not what it, you know, what it is or what I said. And you need a lot of frequent back and forth to me to even have clarity. Just communicating is so challenging. And so I think the way that there's been this, you know, so much deference to the written word and so little opportunity for frequent and constant exchange in order to even make sure people understand each other properly. So I think spaces that would support that, but I think which to me are hyperlocal, probably set with a lot of potential tradition and norms and protocol. But to take that a step further, where are we in this moment with the labor of that? And, you know, I think in the idea of volunteerism, I just want to put this in maybe the last 4 decades, this emergence of philanthropy and the nonprofit sector and civil society has not proven itself to be effective to represent every person. And I think this is where there is a need to really go to what you're asking, which is how do you engage more people in that? But how do you ask people to participate in that kind of activity when they're barely keeping it alive, you know, just to get home to try to have that meal at the end of the day? So I think there are very practical operational questions as to how to pull this off, because to my mind, this becoming voluntary or, you know, fully voluntary or being its own economy hasn't really served its purpose well either. So I think there's something in there as to how do we instantiate the practice of this hyperlocal democracy and gathering and convening in a way that everyone is supported. Because I think about this all the time with Canada. You can't call a country a democracy until everybody can actually engage themselves in it. To my mind, like, and I think that's where many countries have a big gap between, are they theoretically, you know, democratic, liberal democratic, perhaps, but in practice, who is at the table? We have to be honest that what's happening now is there's a lot of people that aren't there, and the representation mechanisms aren't working. So I think, yeah, I think building something that's very local, small, and inefficient, if you will. I think this is the other thing about good relationships, to me, are highly inefficient. You can't pack everything into a 2-hour public meeting. It's just not tenable. You can't make mistakes with each other when things are so high stakes, you know, that we have to do this twice a year. And then that big referendum or that big moment is going to define the course of the next 5 or 10.
For our movie, Bianca, How to Fix Democracy, I also traveled to Ireland to look at their citizen assemblies, which were attempts to put citizens in the same room. Not everyone, citizens drawn from lotteries, modernizing the Greek version of this notion of citizenship. Do you see citizen assemblies as one model for establishing public space in the 21st century?
I do. I see them as one, and I see the opportunity there does address one of the things I mentioned, which is creating like a process where it's very formalized and clear as to how you can participate and get different people involved. I think a couple of the potential pitfalls with that is, the first one is the framing of the education that is provided to those who are about to engage. There's nothing neutral or apolitical about the, you know, the program that's designed there for residents or citizens to engage in a process. And I think the thing that I have struggled with the most lately is from a Western scientific perspective, at least, the lack of capacity to hold on to multiple truths at the same time, you know, like having like different worldviews and being able to see benefit or opportunity and holding different approaches or thoughts about politics together and moving through them. So I guess that's where I find any one approach to this has its upsides, but it also carries with it, I think, an entrenchment and acceleration of some of what's already problematic. And I think at this point in time, that exercise to think about different worldviews and how they work in conversation with each other in politics is particularly relevant as we have these like global issues, you know, heating up literally with the climate. And I don't see our literacy strong in that, you know, and I'm not sure where that falls in general civic education, but the capacity to understand like that you're going to have to deal with things that are in direct opposition and find a way through it takes a very mature framer of a process, like something like that, right? Where everything truly is on the table. I don't see that as a strong muscle again in terms of our democratic process.
Yeah, and your point about the complexity of modern issues, about the environment, about technology is, of course, incorporated into citizen assemblies by this parallel structure of, on the one hand, citizens, and on the other hand, experts. Do you like that? Do we need to have more, if you like, citizen experts leading, educating, helping ordinary citizens, or does that contradict the whole purpose of democracy?
Yeah, it's such a good question because on one hand, in the last decade, the political economy of the professional making things more complex than they should be is truly deeply a problem that I can see, where people have professionalized narrow swaths of, you know, elements related to whether it's human rights or anything else. Like it's, you know, there's something quite troubling when issues are made out to be so complicated. And some of them really are, but some of them are not. And I think being able to disentangle those things is a challenge. And I think, so I like the idea of being offered more information or, you know, things beyond what you may know from different, you know, different expertise, different professionals. But maybe a good way to draw a line here for me is that I feel as though what we're missing right now is operational capacity, like implementation expertise. I feel like we've over-indexed on new and novel and complexities around different, you know, whether it's business models or technologies or whatever else. And there's a lot of like that ideas economy that took hold, particularly, I would say 1980s forward. Governments have lost their operational capacity because they outsourced it to professional management consulting firms. Like that, for me, major problem, major thing we're living with now. So, you know, what kind of expertise are we talking about? And this also brings us back to the question of worldview, which is which experts have the respect within the process that's being put forward, right? Because I can see all the time, and again, in Canada, there's so many different kinds of knowledge, but there is this hyper focus on Western scientific, quantitative, data-driven evidence. But I mean, that's such a short sell on what this large sum and historical amount of human knowledge is. But I don't see these types of knowledge held alongside each other being of parallel and equivalent value. So I think that's super problematic.
Are you calling, Bianca? Some people might say, well, here's this extreme relativism on the left amongst progressives, that the non-scientific, the animistic, the prehistoric position, the Aboriginal position should be just as credible as the scientific one?
Well, I don't know if it's even possible to do that. I think, and I'm not trying to avoid a direct answer there, but you can't take some of those things out of their context, right? And so I think that's where, for me, it's difficult to be specific with one of the examples you raise in terms of Indigenous knowledge in Canada, which is,
yeah, and,
you know,
I bring it up because of Canada's attempt to innovate in this area of integrating Aboriginal voices in governance.
Right. And if there, you know, if that invitation comes with a sort of necessary like repackaging of one type of knowledge into like a Western scientific package, it's not it's not a good situation. And I think in the environment is probably with climate crisis probably one of the best examples of, you've had people who have been looking after lands for a long amount of time and know things about them, and the fact that then they're asked to take and labor to translate what they know into this other model that is the one that is being used for environmental policy doesn't seem right to me. But I don't think this is somewhere to put it into like everything. I know I was doing this like this and this and this. It's not that there's all equivalence, but I do think there is a translation problem there, right? And I think that asking people to engage and then only asking them to engage on your terms, I don't think is the best form of governance. But I also think that this Canada is such a good example of a place struggling to pull off something that should look like nation to nation to nation to nation governance. And how do you do that? And Canada's not doing it well yet, but theoretically it's what we're supposed to be doing as a country. And it would need to address some of the issues we're talking about right now, and so far is not.
Well, to be fair to Canada, I think there's a lot more innovation in your country than there is in many, perhaps including the United States. And you mentioned Toronto, and you mentioned procedural innovation. And you yourself were involved in one of the more interesting experiments when it comes, I'm not sure to citizenship, but to the geography of public space in Toronto, the Sidewalk Labs project, which was pretty controversial. Very briefly describe what the project was, your involvement, and what it tells us about the challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, certainly. So in Toronto, there's a large piece of undeveloped real estate on the waterfront. And for a couple of decades now, there's been an organization, it's now called Waterfront Toronto, that is made up of representation from the city, provincial, and federal governments, who is tasked with the idea of developing that land. And so they've been at that work for a while. And in 2017, they said, hey, there's a piece of land here. They call it Quayside. They said, there's a small piece here. We would like to offer up the development opportunity of this land and go to market and say, hey, we want to have a really innovative, climate friendly, development happen here. And let's see what people come back with. And so they put out a request for proposal and asking for that. And the company that won that tender is Sidewalk Labs, which was a sister company to Google. And then, so in 2017, the project was announced. So it was Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs. And they said, here we go, we're going to do this project by the lake. And the way that it was launched to the public was, it's your plan, it's your, they didn't, I think, ever call it a smart city, but it was one of those that quickly picked up, well, this is a smart city initiative, and it was supposed to be very led by the people of the city, and that's the way that both Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs spoke of it. However, in the years that followed until this project was called off ultimately by Sidewalk Labs, there was significant pushback from people who lived in Toronto, and surprisingly from people who did not live in Toronto, who lived in other countries around the world, saying, hold on, what's going on here? There are so many issues related to the idea of a technology company really being in charge of the development and design of both public space and public life. And what I can say in terms of my participation, because I had worked in both technology and had worked in cities, as soon as it was announced, even prior to it went on for years, but as soon as it was announced, my immediate reaction was, we do not have policies and laws set up for the public interest to be protected and to be defining this. So it was like, to my mind, immediately corporate capture of democratic process. And while many issues that were raised related to, of course, because of data, surveillance, corporate power and all the rest of it, the fundamental element here for me was always, you're privatizing governance now. Like this is a very explicit, and it was written by the governments in a tender. Here, a corporate actor, you decide based on data and technology how this neighborhood should be designed. And no one in the city of Toronto ever signed off on that. But I think, at the end of it, a lot of lessons were learned, and a lot of people, probably from the timing perspective, if you go back to 2017, you had Cambridge Analytica happening. Like it was right at that minute where the world was kind of turning a corner on, wait, is tech a good idea? Like, are all of these things that for maybe the last decade, companies like Google, had been received with that playful whimsy and, oh, look, this is the future, this is innovation. And I think it was really one of those milestones where just in that moment, there was a lot more critique and awareness of what that sort of power dynamic, what it meant to have tech companies designing things like this.
And I think the parable of the Sidewalks project and your presentation of it is fascinating, because it speaks of the failure of the digital revolution to fix the problem of the public and the private, this confusion of the public and private, Bianca, in the way you presented, of Google coming to Google, a massively powerful, profitable private company, coming to Toronto and presenting this particular project as in the interests of the public, is something that Amazon has done in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Seattle, something that has been done certainly in the Bay Area. And I think it speaks of the crisis of the digital in that they pulled it off online. Google presents their search engine as a public utility, a thing that's free, that allows anyone to become wise. That's the whole essence of their marketing. Facebook, of course, have done that. And as we now know, I've spent a lot of my career actually writing about this. As we know, these companies are private companies. They're not public companies. They make enormous profit from the acquisition of our data. So in terms of the kind of chicken and egg, if we're to clean up Google, do we need to clean up the internet? Or does Google simply, companies like Google, need to learn to tell the truth about this distinction between the public and the private spheres?
Yeah, for me, what we need to get into is accountable governance, because I continue to watch some of the discourse around what a corporation does and people looking to a corporation to set out a charter, to respect rights. And I'm looking and I'm thinking, is this how far off everybody is from understanding what a corporation is and how it acts and why it is structured as such? Even cities are corporations. This is a very, for me, no, I never expect corporations to be looking out for public interest. And I think starting there, and the fact that that could have so much currency for so long is part of what, for me, was I kind of knew that, but as I watch this go on, I think, wow. And then I look to government and state and our public institutions, and then I remember why people are looking at these companies in this way. It's because the institution has made itself something that cannot be believed anymore to be operating in the public interest. And that's why I think this is a perfect example of both options being really bad and needing to look at the third ways of, whether this is Elinor Ostrom's work at commons-based governance, taking over models that are different around insurance or how we manage private assets. If we can't own all these infrastructures, we need to understand something. This is what's good about the internet. You don't need to own the infrastructure to say how it has to work. And that's where we can engage and use democracy. You don't need to own it. You can, through the state, use the power of law to say these systems here may not be owned by the state, but they certainly have to operate this way. And that is only going to happen between the public. To me, this is a resident government state conversation.
Yeah, and I think another of the things that these Silicon Valley giants have done is confuse citizenship or the citizen and the consumer. And we don't behave as citizens in these private spaces masquerading as the public. Facebook is the classic example. These are echo chamber communities where we only share space with people we agree with, who reflect us in ideological or racial or gendered terms. And we behave in a most uncitizenly way. So you mentioned Elinor Ostrom and her notion of the public space. There are, and I know you know them pretty well, you're probably involved with them. There are people like Eli Parisa and Talia Stroud in the United States. Their initiative, Civic Signals, is the creation of genuine public space on the internet. Is that possible? Is that a contradiction in terms?
No, I think it's possible, but I think there are two things to acknowledge that have to be understood before saying, is this possible to pull this off? The first one, and you spoke to it, gestured at it at least, Silicon Valley and technology companies, heavily libertarian, right? This is like a go at it on your own. The state is not the thing. The thing is, there's this real confusion with this sort of freedom that people who may not understand or know how deep that libertarianism runs in Silicon Valley, and why that is so detrimental to democracy is because it runs right up against the idea of that. I think insurance is probably the best way to think about it. You work collectively, you put some in, and it's not always going to be your day, but when it's your day and you need it, it's there. Like that idea of having to think about other people, that consumer frame and that libertarian nature of being a user of technology is completely at odds with democracy, right? So even though these companies will put those democratic, fun, public interest, that costume on, the way it works is completely libertarian, right? And I think that's important. I think people need to go down that sort of mindset just to see how counter incentivized you are within these systems to act in a democratic collective way. And I think, and the second piece that I want to mention is related to the confusion even of the state. I will never forget when Senator Al Franken was lambasting Mark Zuckerberg about ad payments coming in Russian rubles. And did you not know that this was happening? This was in the whole Cambridge Analytica time, and this and that. And I'm looking at this and I'm watching people getting happy. They're like, yeah, get mad at Facebook. And I'm sitting there thinking, Senator, this company is not in charge of elections. Like, this is your problem. So I think that is one of those moments where I get, again, that deep fear, that deep-seated fear of like, wow, hold on, like, where are we all in this conversation? Because that's not Facebook's responsibility to be in charge of things like that, right? So I think that the public side of this also has to be strengthened. Like, governments have no capacity to understand technology at this moment because they outsourced that capacity to the private sector, and they did it starting in the 80s. Like, we can't forget how hard it is for the state to take charge of this. But I also have to say, this is negligence. If there's anyone who could possibly show up to help create democratic internet and democratic public, it's the state. They have the money, they have the time, they have the staff, they have the rationale, and they haven't done it, and they haven't done it, and they haven't done it. But I really don't think we should let the state off the hook, because their negligence on this is worse than a corporation acting as a corporation would act.
Recently, I talked to the brilliant American writer, Heather McGhee. I don't know if you know her. She has a new book out, The Sum of Us, which speaks essentially of the looting of the American state over the last 50 years. The privatization of education, the privatization of healthcare, the privatization of every sector. Her argument is actually dressed up in racism. She argues that it's all been done because of the racist insecurity of the white working class. And it seems pretty self-evident that that is what's happened in America. There is a crisis of the public, of the state. Is the same true in Canada, or could Canada be the model for America trying to reinvent itself in the 21st century? Ironic, that Canada, always seen as the younger sister, now might be actually the older sister for America to learn from.
Your question is what is the most disturbing part to me about Canada, is Canada is small enough and rich enough to differentiate itself from the United States, and does not generally. So I would say the opportunity is there, but the instinct and the cultural pull of inheriting what is normalized in the United States and having such a close economic relationship to the United States, there's nothing that happens there just sort of by any kind of, passivity. And we also have such a strong, like, oh, here's foreign direct investment coming from the United States, with so much corporate power exerting itself on the state, it's been really difficult. So in Canada, lobbying is powerful in a different way than it is in the United States. It's not money, funnily enough, it's softer. It's these relationships. It's, lobbyists having lunch, sponsoring a lunch, and inviting all kinds of senior civil servants around a table to spill on all of their problems, and they're all thinking, they're saying, oh, we're doing this for good policy, and so it's both troubling here how much power corporate lobbyists have and how different it is than the US, but it's also an opportunity definitely here with the size and the scale that we're dealing with to do so much better. And it's frankly why I continue to do this work, is because you can see the opportunity because of some of those, just because of the shape of the problem and its size. It's feasible here to do differently, but is the instinct to just replicate what's going on in the United States, and the privatization is there as well, and to ingest, what's coming from there. So opportunity, very fulsome one, but in terms of seeing it in practice, not feeling as great about it. And the last thing that really holds us back in Canada, on top of many, historical injustices that have not been remedied yet, and we don't have structural nation to nation governance, for one. The second one is cities are where all the people are and where none of the power and money is. And so we really need to have a reorganization of transfer agreements, which is a pretty wonky policy situation, but if we really want to pull it off, believe that we need way more money and power flowing to the cities, which is also good globally. And I think that makes it easier to imagine better futures. And I think you've probably seen it in the United States as well. Some of the most wonderful initiatives are really coming out of cities, and there is hope there. So hopefully, that some of those adjustments can be made from a policy perspective.
Well, I'm glad there is hope. Bianca Wylie, leave us on as the co-founder of Digital Public, leave us on a positive note. One short story, one example of something that's been done right.
So one thing that's being done right, and it came out of the Sidewalk Labs project in the city of Toronto, was and is the creation of something called a digital infrastructure plan. And the idea is there a new type of public policy document and approach that would start to shift this power in ways that we're talking about? And so the city of Toronto is undergoing that process right now. And it is informing both hiring, organizational, like looking at who do we bring in to work on this, and how do we build that muscle back up so that we've got state and local capacity regarding technology driving, so that we stop mitigating and being defensive all the time to these really significant sources of power. So that and to just tie it to a bigger, broader good story is the Cities for Digital Rights Coalition, which is cities all over the world trying to set up these types of policies locally and working together across countries to have a community of practice and talk about, taking these things from the abstract and bringing them into implementation, and showing people, yes, the state can be trusted to use technology and to use it well and to do it in the public interest. And I think this ties in really nicely also to the moment of saying, look, if you want to be trusted, you have to show up properly for the public, and you can't be, going down these roads where you just piling on more surveillance and other technologies. So I see hope in cities. I see hope in implementation and praxis and practical application of these things, and seeing investments in people, because at the end of it, people and the relationships they have to each other to do these things differently, that's where there's hope. And so there is good news story coming out of what happened here in Toronto as well, which is good.
Well, Bianca Wylie, you've shown up for the public. I appreciate your contribution to our series, How to Fix Democracy, and particularly your focus on the digital or analog space necessary for citizenship. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.